All right, I think we'll go ahead and begin. Thanks everyone for coming this afternoon. I want to welcome you on behalf of the History Department and the Gady Institute to the fourth Erasmus Lecture of the year. Erasmus Series is an interdisciplinary lecture series in the humanities, and the History Department participates along with several other departments in sponsoring these lectures. And my name is Rick Pointer. I teach in the History Department here. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Randall Balmer. Randy comes to us today from Dartmouth College, where he's the chair of the Religion Department and the Mandel Family Professor in the Arts and Sciences. He and his wife, Catherine, who's here in the back, moved to Dartmouth in the summer of 2012, following a very long stint, 25 plus years, in New York City at Barnard and Columbia University. Randy's higher education began in a familiar place to me, Trinity College, where I taught before coming to Westmont 20 years ago. He was there before I was. But his time at Trinity included a semester at the Oregon Extension Program, which is an off-campus opportunity still available to Westmont students. I think you were amongst the very first semester. Wow, the inaugural semester there. Randy went on to earn a Ph.D. at Princeton University, and he wrote his first book on religion in colonial New Jersey about the same time I was working on colonial New York. So we had much in common in those days in terms of our research interests. Since then, he's gone on to write another dozen or so books in American religious history. Most of those focused on the 20th century. Those books and many other writings have been marked not only by analytical insight, but wonderful grace in terms of the writing style, and also a kind of boldness to speak some hard truths, even to those with whom he shares many affinities. Among his best-known works are The Making of Evangelicalism, From Revivalism to Politics and Beyond, and Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory, A Journey into the Evangelical Subculture, the fifth edition of which will be released this summer, the 25th anniversary of the book's publication. That book also became the basis of a series of television documentaries that aired on PBS, for which Randy received an Emmy nomination. Amid all his other activities, he recently took orders as an Episcopal priest, joining his wife in that regard. Both are Episcopal priests. And Randy keeps up an active role as a public intellectual, contributing commentaries on religion in America to newspapers and magazines throughout the country. His newest book, to be released in May, is entitled Redeemer, The Life of Jimmy Carter. And his talk today draws on that work and is entitled His Own Received Him Not, Jimmy Carter, the Religious Right, and the Eclipse of Progressive Evangelicalism. The format for this afternoon is that Dr. Balmer will give his lecture, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers. And we're going to encourage students, especially, who are in the great majority this afternoon here, to ask the first number of questions. So as you listen this afternoon, let me encourage you to be formulating a question or two. Please join me then in welcoming Dr. Balmer to Westmont.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for welcoming me to give some thoughts on a book that's coming out. I didn't attend Westmont because I don't think I knew it existed back in the early 1970s when I was looking for colleges, and I made the perhaps unfortunate choice of going to college in Deerfield, Illinois, rather than here on the American Riviera. I don't know how any of you get any work done. This is an extraordinary place. My wife, Catherine, is with me. The lovely and talented Catherine Randall. Her last name is the same as my first name. When we want to annoy her mother, we say that we had to get married. Catherine was for more than 20 years a professor of French at Fordham University, and is now joined me in the religion department at Dartmouth, where she teaches. A very popular teacher. If you know her, you know why that would be the case. If scholarship is autobiography, and I think it probably is, this project really grew out of my college years. I was at Trinity from 1972 to 1976, which I know is ancient history for most of you in this room. And I was very intrigued because during that time, a presidential candidate emerged, and he said unabashedly that he was a born-again Christian. Now, we all said that about ourselves, but we were kind of shy about it and didn't want to announce it, at least too brazenly. And this was quite a phenomenon. And I remember charting the rise of Jimmy Carter from being a one-term governor of Georgia to becoming a presidential candidate. He declared his candidacy in December of 1974, and then he began to move through the Iowa precinct caucuses and through the primaries and emerged as the Democratic nominee, and then, of course, was elected president in 1976. And to me, this was just quite remarkable. And so that was the beginning of my interest in Jimmy Carter. In more recent years, I've been interested in him for a lot of reasons as well. And part of it was the puzzle to me is why it was that Jimmy Carter, who burst on the national scene in the mid-1970s with the support of many, many evangelicals, why it was that 4 years later, when he ran for re-election, evangelicals had turned almost entirely, in many cases rabidly, against Jimmy Carter. Now, Jimmy Carter emerged as a national figure riding, I think, two currents. One was his reputation as a New South governor, that is, a post-racist governor. And one of his great accomplishments that I think is not remembered by historians as frequently as it should be was the fact that he vanquished a fellow Southern governor, George C. Wallace of Alabama, in the Florida Democratic primary in March of 1976, thereby effectively ending the career of one of the nation's most notorious segregationists. So Jimmy Carter was running as the New South governor. He was also running as an evangelical, and more particularly progressive evangelical. And I want to take just a minute to talk about this. I'm sure you all know this from taking Professor Pointer's classes and your other courses here. But throughout much of American history, evangelicalism, to the extent it was political, and it hasn't always been political, especially for much of the 20th century, but especially in the 19th century, evangelicals really crowded toward what we would consider the left of the political spectrum. Particularly in the antebellum period. Evangelicals were very much animated by something called postmillennialism. You probably know what that is, so I won't explain it. But they believed that they could construct a godly society here on earth in the 19th century. And they proceeded to do that by opposing slavery, recognizing slavery as the moral scourge that it was in the antebellum period, by supporting prison reform, the whole idea of a penitentiary, a place not merely where you would segregate criminals off from the rest of society, but a place where they could become penitent and thereby rejoin society at a later point after they'd been rehabilitated. The common school movement, or what we call public schools today, or public education, was very much supported by evangelicals in the antebellum period because this was seen as one of the keys for democracy. This was also seen as a socially leveling movement that would provide those on the lower reaches of society a leg up on this ladder of opportunity in the 19th century. Evangelicals in the antebellum period were very much in favor of women's rights, including voting rights. This is all part of this legacy of progressive evangelicalism that really persisted into the early part of the 20th century. William Jennings Bryan would probably be the last great proponent of progressive evangelicalism, or at least in a public way. Well, what happened with Jimmy Carter is that in the early 1970s, there was a brief resurgence of progressive evangelicalism that was probably encapsulated for the most part in something called the Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern that was formulated by a group of 55 evangelicals meeting at the Wabash YMCA in the south side of Chicago in November of 1973. If you read through that statement, and by the way, it's available on the web, and I encourage you to do that, it's really a remarkable statement that talked about the perils of militarism, very much the way that evangelicals in the antebellum period had done. It talked about the scourge of racism, the persistence of racism in the 20th century. Talked about the importance of according women equal rights. These were all many other things as well, all part of the Chicago Declaration. And so when Jimmy Carter emerges as a political candidate, as a presidential candidate in early, he announces in December of 1974, he picks up on a lot of those themes. And so it resonates with a lot of evangelicals, those who are especially in the more progressive end of things. A lot of folks in this room will remember that probably, I don't know if there were any indexes at the time for this, but one of the most popular evangelical books in the 1970s was a book by the name of somebody by the name of Ronald Sider called Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger. And evangelicals were very much concerned about these issues, issues of poverty, issues of war, issues of hunger, issues of economic inequality. And Jimmy Carter rode that wave in part to the White House in 1976. So the story I want to tell today is what happened, how it is that many of those same evangelicals who supported him in 1976 turned so dramatically against him over the course of the 4 years of his presidency. I apologize for this. I'm going to read my remarks, and I prefer to just kind of keep talking here. But the problem is, having just completed this biography, is that as I kind of talk through it, I think of all these little pathways into the raspberry bushes, and I want to kind of keep on the straight and narrow, so to speak, in telling this story. So you'll pardon me for reading this. It's not terribly long, but I want to make this case. As the 1980 presidential campaign reached its climax, an interested citizen, a preacher, picked up the telephone. Although the race was still fluid, his preferred candidate was trailing in the polls, and yet inserting himself explicitly into the race was dicey. His ability to sway voters, especially religious voters, was undisputed, but that influence derived precisely from his ability to appear above the fray. Over the course of a long and distinguished career, he had perfected the art of the discreet political gesture, a strategic handshake, a brief touch on the shoulder, a whispered aside in front of the television cameras to telegraph his preferences. But this election was especially fraught. One candidate, the incumbent running for re-election, was known as a family man who shared the preacher's evangelical theological convictions almost verbatim. The other major candidate, divorced and remarried, had spent much of his career in Hollywood, a province not known to evangelicals as an outpost of piety. Still another candidate, John B. Anderson, who was mounting a third-party challenge, was a member of the Evangelical Free Church, which happens to be my denomination growing up, an evangelical denomination with deep roots in Scandinavian pietism. Receiver in hand, the preacher considered his options one last time and punched the numbers. At the other end of the line was Paul Laxalt, United States Senator from Nevada and national chairman of Ronald Reagan's campaign for president. A memorandum in the Reagan Library tells the remainder of the story. Billy Graham called, the senator wrote, wants to help short of public endorsement. Then Laxalt added, his presence, in my view, would be exceedingly helpful in some of our key states. 11 days later, Graham sent a letter to Robert L. Maddox, Jimmy Carter's religious liaison. I wanted to discuss the religious situation and the political campaign, Graham wrote. As you know, with the Lord's help, I am staying out of it. Naturally, I am losing some support from people who normally support me. Graham nevertheless sought to distinguish himself from the, quote, extreme right, who are getting a great deal of exposure right now. Graham's statement that he was, quote, staying out of the political campaign was, to say the least, disingenuous. Nor was this the first presidential campaign where Graham pushed the boundaries of credibility. 20 years earlier, on August 10th, 1960, Graham sent a letter to John F. Kennedy, the Democratic nominee, pledging that he would not raise the religious issue in the fall campaign. 8 days later, Graham convened a group of American Protestant ministers in Montreux, Switzerland, to strategize about how they might prevent Kennedy's election that November. Later in the same campaign, Graham visited Henry Luce at the Time and Life building, and according to Graham's autobiography said, quote, "I want to help Nixon without blatantly endorsing him." Graham drafted an article praising Nixon that stopped just short of a full endorsement. Luce was prepared to run it in Life magazine, but pulled it at the last minute. In 1960, 8 days had elapsed between Graham's letter of assurance to Kennedy and the Montreux meeting. During the 1980 campaign, 11 days separated Graham's phone call offering help to the Republican nominee and his pledge of neutrality to a staff member of the Democratic nominee. Even earlier, Graham had convened a dozen fellow preachers in Dallas for a special time of prayer and talk about the upcoming presidential election. Carter's liaison for religious affairs had only recently returned from a visit to the evangelist's home in Montreat, North Carolina, with a report that Graham, quote, supports the president wholeheartedly. But that support was apparently less than robust. The Dallas guest list, formulated by Graham himself, included his brother-in-law, Clayton Bell, Rex Humbard, and James Robeson, both of them televangelists, and a roster of well-known Southern Baptists, including Charles Stanley, Jimmy Draper, and Adrian Rogers, the new president of the Southern Baptist Convention, who had recently visited Carter at the White House and declared it, quote, one of the highlights of my life. The ministers, gathered at Graham's behest, occupied nearly an entire floor of the hotel. It really was Billy's meeting, Robeson recalled. What he wanted us to do was pray together for a couple of days and to understand something very significant had to happen. The unmistakable subtext of the gathering was the need to rally behind someone who could mount a challenge to Carter. No one was talking about Jimmy Carter's faith, Robeson said. It was his ability to lead. Just as he had done at the Montreux gathering of Protestant ministers in 1960, Graham made it clear to the participants in Dallas that he could not be the point person for such a crusade in opposition to Carter. The evangelist was still too damaged from his associations with Richard Nixon, and wanted, publicly at least, to remain above the fray of politics. According to Robeson, a consensus emerged, quote, that if former California Governor Ronald Reagan had the conviction that he appeared to have, he would be a good choice to displace Carter. Robeson was chosen to approach the Reagan camp to ascertain how serious he was about another run for the presidency. Reagan was not the only contender for evangelical sympathies. His divorce and his Hollywood pedigree made many evangelicals uneasy. Paul Weyrich, architect of the religious right, set up a meeting between conservative evangelical leaders and John Connally, the former Democratic governor of Texas who served as Richard Nixon's Secretary of the Treasury and who had changed his party affiliation to Republican in 1973. Sorry, I love this story. The meeting was going smoothly until one of the preachers asked Connally's views on secular humanism. No one, apparently, had briefed the former governor that the term secular humanism was religious right code language for everything amiss in America. Well, I don't know much about it, Connally declared. Sounds good to me. Leaders of the religious right settled on Reagan. The religious right's most cherished and durable myth is the myth of origins. According to this well-rehearsed narrative, articulated by Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and countless others, after decades of political inactivity, evangelical leaders were shaken out of their complacency by the United States Supreme Court's Roe v. Wade decision of January 22, 1973. Falwell even recounted, albeit 14 years later, his horror at reading the news in the January 23, 1973 edition of the Lynchburg News. The Supreme Court had just made a decision by a 7-2 margin that would legalize the killing of millions of unborn children, Falwell wrote. I sat there staring at the Roe v. Wade story, growing more and more fearful of the consequences of the Supreme Court's act and wondering why so few voices had been raised against it. The myth of origins has Falwell and other evangelical leaders emerging like a mollusk out of their apolitical stupor to fight the moral outrage of legalized abortion. Some even went so far as to invoke the moniker New Abolitionists in an effort to ally themselves with their antebellum evangelical predecessors who sought to eradicate the scourge of slavery. I want to be clear here. I'm not, in telling the story, I'm not staking out a position personally on abortion. I'd be happy to talk about that if somebody wants to raise it later. But merely to say that even though abortion is often cited as the reason for the mobilization of these politically conservative evangelicals in the 1970s, it's not the case, and I will continue to make my case. What I don't have in here, and I'm going to add it quickly here, is that in 1969, this is obviously before the Roe v. Wade decision, Christianity Today and the Christian Medical Society had a conference to discuss abortion. And the proceedings are published. I'm sure it's in the Westmont Library if you want to look at it yourself. But there was no clear consensus coming out of that conference on looking at the morality of abortion, except for two things. And people, some of the people who were there were Carl F.H. Henry, as you might imagine, former editor of Christianity Today, but also Bruce Watke and Norman Geisler and others. But they did agree on two things. One was that a fetus was not the moral equivalent of a person. Now, again, I'm not taking a position on this personally. I'm just reporting what came out of that conference. The second thing that they agreed was that abortion should be legally permissible under certain circumstances. But there was, again, the point of that anecdote is to say that there was no clear consensus on the part of evangelicals against abortion when that gathering took place. The abortion myth, however, collapses in the face of historical scrutiny. In 1970, the United Methodist Church General Conference called on state legislatures to repeal laws restricting abortion. And in 1972, the Methodists acknowledged, quote, the sanctity of unborn human life, but also declared that, quote, we are equally bound to respect the sacredness of the life and well-being of the mother, for whom devastating damage may result from unacceptable pregnancy. Meeting in St. Louis, Missouri during the summer of 1971, the messengers, or delegates, to the Southern Baptist Convention passed a resolution that stated, quote, we call upon Southern Baptists to work for legislation that will allow the possibility of abortion under such conditions as rape, incest, clear evidence of severe fetal deformity, and carefully ascertained evidence of the likelihood of damage to the emotional, mental, and physical health of the mother. The Southern Baptist Convention, hardly a redoubt of liberalism, reaffirmed that position in 1974, the year after the Roe decision, and again in 1976. When the Roe decision was handed down, W.A. Criswell, former president of the Southern Baptist Convention and pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, expressed his satisfaction with the ruling. I have always felt that it was only after a child was born and had a life separate from its mother that it became an individual person, one of the most famous fundamentalists of the 20th century declared, and it has always therefore seemed to me that what is best for the mother and for the future should be allowed. While a few evangelical voices, including Christianity Today magazine, mildly criticized the ruling, and it was a mild criticism, the overwhelming response on the part of evangelicals was silence, even approval. Baptists in particular applauded the decision as an appropriate articulation of the line of division between church and state, between personal morality and state regulation of individual behavior. Religious liberty, human equality, and justice are advanced by the Supreme Court abortion decision, W. Barry Garrett of Baptist Press wrote. The real origins, and again, I want to emphasize, I'm not staking out a position on abortion, just pointing out the historical circumstances here. The real origins of the religious right are rather more prosaic and less high-minded. In May 1969, a group of African-American parents in Holmes County, Mississippi, filed suit to prevent 3 new whites-only academies from securing tax exemption from the Internal Revenue Service. Each of the schools had been founded to evade desegregation of the public schools. In Holmes County, the number of white students enrolled in the public schools had dropped from 771 to 28 during the first year of desegregation. The following year, that number fell to 0. The court case, known as Green v. Kennedy, won a temporary injunction against the segregation academies in January 1970. And later that year, Richard Nixon ordered the IRS to enact a new policy that would deny tax exemptions to segregated schools. In July 1970, the Internal Revenue Service announced that in accordance with the provisions of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which forbade racial segregation and discrimination, it would no longer grant tax-exempt status to private schools with racially discriminatory policies. Such institutions were not, by definition, charitable organizations, and therefore they had no claims to tax-exempt status. Similarly, donations to such organizations would no longer qualify as tax-deductible contributions. On November 30th, 1970, the IRS sent letters of inquiry to schools in question in an effort to ascertain whether or not they discriminated on the basis of race. Bob Jones University, a fundamentalist school in Greenville, South Carolina, responded that it did not admit African Americans. Meanwhile, the Green v. Kennedy suit was joined with a similar suit to become Green v. Connolly. On June 30th, 1971, the United States District Court for the District of Columbia issued its ruling in the Green v. Connolly case. Quote, under the Internal Revenue Code properly construed, racially discriminatory private schools are not entitled to the federal tax exemption provided for charitable, educational institutions, and persons making gifts to such schools are not entitled to deductions provided in the case of gifts to charitable educational institutions. Paul Weyrich saw his opening. Ever since Barry Goldwater's campaign for the presidency in 1964, Weyrich had been trying to organize evangelicals politically. Their numbers alone, he reasoned, would constitute a formidable voting bloc, and he aspired to marshal them behind conservative causes. The new political philosophy must be defined by us in moral terms, packaged in non-religious language, and propagated throughout the country by our new coalition, Weyrich wrote in spelling out his vision. What political powers achieve, the moral majority will have the opportunity to recreate this great nation. Weyrich believed that the political possibilities of such a coalition were limitless. The leadership, moral philosophy, and workable vehicle are at hand, just waiting to be blended and activated, he wrote. If the moral majority acts, results could well exceed our wildest dreams. But Weyrich's dreams, still a hypothetical coalition which he already referred to as moral majority, lowercase letters, needed a catalyst, not simply an event or issue that would ignite all the indignation that had been accumulating, but also a standard around which to rally. For nearly 2 decades, Weyrich, by his own account, had tried various issues to pique evangelical interest in his scheme, including pornography, school prayer, the proposed Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution, and abortion. I was trying to get these people interested in those issues, and I utterly failed, Weyrich recalled in 1990. What changed their mind was Jimmy Carter's intervention against the Christian schools, trying to deny them tax exemption on the basis of so-called de facto segregation. Because the Green v. Connolly ruling was applicable to all private schools in the United States at all levels of education, Bob Jones University stood directly in the IRS crosshairs. Founded in Florida by arch-fundamentalist Bob Jones in 1926, the school had been located for a time in Cleveland, Tennessee, before moving to South Carolina in 1947. In response to Green v. Connolly, Bob Jones University admitted a married black man, a worker in the school's radio station, as a part-time student. He dropped out a month later. Out of fears of racial mixing, the school maintained its restrictions against admitting unmarried African Americans until 1975. Even then, however, the school stipulated that interracial dating would be grounds for expulsion, and the school also promised that any students who, quote, espouse, promote, or encourage others to violate the university's dating rules and regulations will be expelled. The Internal Revenue Service pursued its case against Bob Jones University and notified the school of the proposed revocation of its tax-exempt status. On January 19, 1976, the IRS officially revoked Bob Jones University's tax-exempt status, effective retroactively to 1971, when the school had first been formally notified of the IRS policy. As Bob Jones University sued to retain its tax exemption, Weyrich pressed his case. Evangelical leaders, especially those whose schools were affected by the ruling, were angry, construing the decision as government intrusion in religious matters. Weyrich used the Green v. Connolly case to rally evangelicals against the government. When the Internal Revenue Service tried to deny tax exemption to private schools, Weyrich said in an interview with Conservative Digest, that more than any single act brought the fundamentalists and evangelicals into the political process. Inadvertently, during the course of the Carter administration, the Internal Revenue Service poured fuel on the embers of evangelical resentment. Although there is no evidence to suggest that the Carter White House participated in drafting the regulations, and Carter himself assured me that he had nothing to do with it, Jerome Kurtz, the IRS commissioner, on August 22, 1978, proposed that schools founded or expanded at the time of desegregation of public schools in their locality meet a quota of minority students, or certified that they operated, quote, in good faith on a racially non-discriminatory basis. The regulations, in effect, shifted the burden of proof from the Internal Revenue Service to the schools. A number of evangelicals interpreted the IRS proposals as an unwarranted violation of the sanctity of their subculture, a network of alternative institutions they had constructed as a shelter from worldliness in the decades following the Scopes trial of 1925. Evangelicals flooded the IRS with letters of protest, more than 125,000 in all. The proposed regulations kicked a sleeping dog. Richard Viguerie, one of the founders of the New Right, said, it was the episode that ignited the religious right's involvement in real politics. When Conservative Digest cataloged evangelical discontent with Carter in August 1979, the Internal Revenue Service regulations headed the list. Abortion was not mentioned. In ramping up for political activism, evangelicals portrayed themselves as defending not the sanctity of life, but the sanctity of the evangelical subculture from outside interference. Weyrich astutely picked up on those fears. What caused the movement to surface was the federal government's moves against Christian schools, Weyrich reiterated in 1990. This absolutely shattered the Christian community's notions that Christians could isolate themselves inside their own institutions and teach what they pleased. For agitated evangelicals, Weyrich's conservative gospel of less government suddenly struck a responsive chord. It wasn't the abortion issue, that wasn't sufficient, Weyrich recalled. It was the recognition that isolation simply would no longer work in this society. The actions of the Internal Revenue Service especially affected Bob Jones University, goading those associated with the school into political activism. Elmer L. Rumminger, longtime administrator at the university who became politically active in 1980, remembered that the IRS case, quote, alerted the Christian school community about what could happen with government interference in the affairs of evangelical institutions. That was really the major issue that got us all involved to begin with. At least it was for me. What about abortion? I asked. No, that wasn't the issue, he said emphatically. This wasn't an anti-abortion movement per se. That was one of the issues where we were interested in. I'm sure some people pointed to Roe v. Wade, but that's not what got us going. The IRS pursuit of Bob Jones University and other schools may have captured the attention of evangelical leaders, but Weyrich was clever enough to realize that the political mobilization of evangelical and fundamentalist leaders represented only half of the equation. Unless these leaders could enlist rank-and-file evangelicals, Weyrich's dream of a politically conservative coalition of evangelicals would remain unfulfilled. Weyrich needed a populist issue to rally conservative evangelicals. The schools issue, while important to evangelical leaders, simply didn't carry enough heft to resonate with rank-and-file evangelicals. And by the mid-1970s, defending racial discrimination was a tough sell. And here is where abortion finally figures into the narrative. In persuading evangelicals that abortion was a moral issue that demanded their political activism, Weyrich received help from an unlikely source, a goateed knickers-wearing philosopher and Presbyterian minister Francis A. Schaeffer, who, together with his wife, ran a community and study center in Switzerland. Schaeffer, considered by many the intellectual godfather of the religious right, began to weigh in about the pervasiveness of what he called secular humanism in American society. He lamented the loss of a basically Christian consensus and said that we now live in a secularized society. By the late 1970s, Schaeffer was beginning to cite abortion as one consequence of a troubling cultural shift away from the mores of evangelical Christianity and toward the reviled secular humanism. Schaeffer viewed abortion as the inevitable prelude to infanticide and euthanasia, and he wanted to sound the alarm. When Schaeffer visited Fulton J. Sheen, the famous Roman Catholic bishop in the late 1970s, Sheen applauded Schaeffer for his attempts to engage Protestants on the abortion issue. The problem is, Sheen said, that abortion is perceived as a Catholic issue. I want you to help me change that. Schaeffer did so through his writing and lectures, but he also teamed with C. Everett Koop, a pediatric surgeon, to produce a series of five films collectively titled Whatever Happened to the Human Race. These films, produced by Billy Zioli, Gerald Ford's religious advisor, financed in part by Richard DeVos of Amway, and directed by Schaeffer's son, Frank, found a wide audience among evangelicals when they appeared in 1979. Although Francis Schaeffer died in 1983, and Frank Schaeffer now claims that his father was appalled by the machinations of religious right leaders, the films, together with a companion book by the same title, served to introduce abortion to evangelicals as a moral concern. By the end of Whatever Happened to the Human Race tour, Frank Schaeffer recalled, we were calling for civil disobedience, the takeover of the Republican Party, and even hinting at overthrowing our unjust pro-abortion government. Years later, Robert Maddox, Jimmy Carter's liaison for religious affairs, recounted his only encounter with Schaeffer, who was visiting the office of Alonzo McDonald, an evangelical who served as Carter's deputy chief of staff. I think you've caused a great damage here with this abortion stuff, Maddox said. Schaeffer's quiet response, according to Maddox, could be. Weirich's prescience about expanding abortion from a preponderantly Catholic issue into an evangelical preoccupation was nothing short of brilliant. His success in blaming Carter for the IRS action against Christian schools may also have been brilliant, but it was also mendacious because Carter bore no responsibility for that. After years of warnings, the Internal Revenue Service finally rescinded the tax exemption of Bob Jones University on January 19, 1976. Some of you know where I'm headed here with this date, because of its persistent racial policies. That date, January 1976, was a notable one for Jimmy Carter, but not because he was in any way responsible for the action against Bob Jones University. Carter won the Iowa precinct caucuses on January 19, 1976, his first major step toward capturing the Democratic presidential nomination. He took office as president a year and a day later. Weirich and the religious right, however, persuaded many evangelicals that Carter, not Gerald Ford, who was then president, was somehow responsible for this unconscionable assault on Christian schools. In Weirich's words, Jimmy Carter's intervention against the Christian schools, trying to deny them tax-exempt status on the basis of so-called de facto segregation, prompted preachers like Jerry Falwell to mobilize against him. For politically conservative evangelicals in the late 1970s, Jimmy Carter's refusal to seek a constitutional amendment banning abortion came to be seen as an unpardonable sin. Despite his long-standing opposition to abortion and the efforts of his administration to limit the incidence of abortion, Carter, in fact, had a longer and more consistent record of opposing abortion than Ronald Reagan. The 1980 presidential election would test the mettle of this new coalition crafted by the hands of Weirich, Falwell, and others. Progressive evangelicals who had contributed to Carter's electoral coalition in 1976 stayed on the sidelines in 1980. John Alexander, editor of The Other Side, suggested that his readers vote for Donald Duck. Under the tutelage of operatives like Paul Weyrich, on the other hand, the religious right had fashioned an estimable political machine, which they used to deny one of their own, Jimmy Carter, a second term as president. Jimmy Carter's defeat in 1980 marked a turning point in the history of evangelicalism in America. Carter had ascended to office by dint of his probity, a welcome departure from the endless prevarications that had characterized Nixon and his administration. Carter also benefited from the brief resurgence of progressive evangelicalism, as demonstrated by the 1973 Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern. Although Carter's policies were consistent with the principles of progressive evangelicalism, the leaders of the religious right peddled a different vision, one characterized less by community, human rights, and care for those less fortunate than by free market capitalism and a muscular foreign policy. The rise of the religious right and the demise of progressive evangelicalism also transformed American politics, contributing to the election of Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and countless hard-right conservatives on the state and local levels. The repudiation of Carter and progressive evangelicalism, however, effectively severed ties with a venerable and once ascendant strain of evangelicalism, one that took seriously the words of Jesus to be peacemakers and to care for the least of these. Carter, running as a born-again progressive evangelical, had harvested the votes of evangelicals, many of whom relished the opportunity to vote for one of their own. 4 years later, however, many of those same evangelicals, marching to the tune of Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell, turned rabidly against him. Paraphrasing the words of St. John, Carter came unto his own in 1976, but by 1980, his own received him not. Thank you. All right.